Welcome to CS288 Module 3. We're going to cover Chapter 4, Installing and Configuring the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. So before we get into our slide presentation, let's go to our Lab 3 assignment. So in order to get started on Lab 3, you're going to want to make sure you download the vmnetconfig.exe file from Moodle. So you're going to actually see that in Moodle when you go to Lab 3. There's your vmnetconfig file. Go ahead and click on that to download it, and then you're going to use that, as you see in the instructions here, to help your different networks, your virtual machines, be able to communicate back and forth using the DHCP protocol. And then you'll continue on by capturing these various different screenshots and then turn in your submission as usual. So let's talk about DHCP. We're going to talk about the basics, describe the different components, install DHCP on a server, configure it, and then administer DHCP on clients and servers. And we're going to talk about troubleshooting DHCP as well. So DHCP, Layer 4 protocol that uses the User Datagram Protocol, UDP, datagrams for communication. Clients use UDP port 68 to send and receive DHCP broadcast communication. Servers, however, use UDP port 67 to send and receive. So if your firewall is blocking UDP ports 67 and 68, you're not going to be able to receive a DHCP IP address. So if you take a look at a DHCP client, maybe this is your PC, DHCP server, maybe this is your Windows 2008 server, you can see it sends a request on 67, destination 68, source 68, destination 67. So you can kind of see how those are all connected. Exploring DHCP components and processes. DHCP Lease defines the amount of time or the duration that an IP address is loaned to a DHCP client. Let's go back to our previous one. Here you can see it says incorrect why. This will be something for you to figure out, and you take a look in your book as to why this screenshot is incorrect. Lease duration, that's the amount of time a client keeps an IP address before releasing it. DHCP scope is a range of IP addresses and related configuration information available by request from a DHCP client. This is what a server manager looks like with DHCP set up on it. You can see here in the DHCP server area that you've got a scope set up, an IP version 4 scope. We're not going to be setting up an IP version 6 scope, but that is also available. You can see the addresses, you can see the address information, all different kinds of stuff, which I'll go over for you in our virtual machine. Over on the right-hand side, you can see the client IP addresses. You can see the name, which is the name of the computer itself. You can see the lease duration, the type, and the unique ID, which is tied to the MAC address of the network card. DHCP options: IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, primary and secondary DNS servers, and the lease expiration. You can get all that information if you do an ipconfig/all. So if we take a look, we can see there's the IP address, just like it says here. There's the subnet mask. There's the gateway. And here's different additional information such as DHCP 6, which we're not using as far as a managed server goes. DNS server information. NetBIOS over TCP/IP, that's broadcast, whether that's turned on or not for older computers. I have mine turned on, but you can turn yours off if you want. Additional information that you see here as well. And it also tells you the name of the DHCP server, or the IP address of the DHCP server itself. So that is all the information you can get there right from an ipconfig/all. And DHCP Reservations, I'll actually show you how to do that. Allows you to assign a specific IP address to a DHCP client without statically configuring. So if you want to have a printer, for instance, on DHCP, you don't want to set it statically for whatever reason, then you could set it so it always gets the same IP address every single time, so it's easier to find when people want to go print to it. And I'll show you how to do that. So some common DHCP options. You have a code, and then you have an option name. So these are options that you'll see in the DHCP server, which I'll show you in a little bit. So a code 3 is the router, a code 6 is the DNS server, etc., all the way down the line. Now there's actually dozens and dozens of different codes and options that you can use, some of which you may never use, and others you may only use for really odd things, such as if you have IP phones, they use special types of codes and options that computers don't use, and that's why you need to know that those options are available. The DHCP communication process. So you've got the DHCP Discover and the Offer. That's what the computer client will do, and you've got the request to the server, the acknowledgement, and that means that the server has received the request, acknowledged it. You also have a DHCP decline, or a NAC, saying that, hey, I don't want a DHCP. Maybe I've got a static IP address, or I've gotten DHCP from another device. Initial lease request. Clients make these requests if they do not have a current lease on a scope. So if they don't have a current IP address, then they will make this request. Hey, is there anybody out there to give me an IP address? Lease renewals. This is how long before your DHCP server will renew your request. And we'll show you why that can be a problem in a little bit. So you've got the client computer once again making the request, the server making the acknowledgement. Changing subnets. When a client moves to a new subnet, it cannot use its current lease because the IP information does not match the new network configuration. So let's just say, for instance, that you decide to change subnets or move your computer to another location, but it still has the IP address from the old DHCP server. Well, it will no longer be able to communicate with the rest of the world until you do a release on that IP address and get a renewed IP address from the new DHCP server. So you've got a DHCP client, does a request. Then we've got the DHCP NAC, Discover, Offer, Request, DHCP Acknowledgement. So there's the different ways of communicating between the client and the server. You've got two different types of states when it comes to IP version 6. You've got stateless and stateful. So if it's stateless, auto-addressing of global IP addresses. This is that automatic private IP addressing situation in IP version 4 we talked about in the last module. You've also got multicast router solicitation, append 64-bit MAC or random ID to test uniqueness. So if you don't have a DHCP IP version 6 server on there, and you've got two computers that want to communicate with each other, then they will talk to each other to make sure that they don't accidentally give each other the same automatic private IP address. Stateful means you've got a managed DHCP server that does IP version 6. Multicast router solicitation, get referral to server, and addresses, tracked, and options info via DHCP version 6. So this basically means that you've set up your DHCP server on a server, such as 2008, and it's being managed. Stateless means you don't have one, but you still get one. You still get an automatic IP address anyway. Stateless on version 6, installing DHCP version 6 on Windows 2008, verify stateless operation mode, configure required options. So if we configure a DHCP server but we decide to not configure DHCP version 6, automatically goes into stateless mode. Stateful DHCP version 6 requires you configure the network router to forward all the auto configuration requests on version 6 server. So you'll want to, unless it does it automatically, you'll want to go into the router and you want to tell it, hey, make sure you send over version 6, not just version 4, or maybe even eliminate 4 altogether because it's no longer necessary. The DHCP server role requires minimal server resources. It's pretty easy to set up on any server. All you have to do is install it through Server Manager, which I'll show you in a minute. Starts the DHCP server service, installs the files, and initializes the DHCP console on the local system. The DHCP is made up of a database. The size is based on the number of client requests. The more requests you have, the larger the database gets, but it never gets that large to begin with since it's such a small service. The server service is installed with the DHCP server role. So if you just install DHCP Server on your Windows 2008 server, then you will see a new service for DHCP Server. The DHCP Server console is the GUI tool for managing the DHCP on Windows Server 2008, which I will show you. In Active Directory domains, this means if you have Active Directory running, not just in a work group, but an actual Active Directory where there are domain controllers, then you must authorize a DHCP server so that way you don't end up running into another DHCP server. So it's its way of protecting itself. In Server 2008, you're prompted for credentials during installation if your server is a member of a domain. So let's take a look at this. We're in Server Manager on Windows 2008. We're going to click on Add Roles. And the role we're going to add is DHCP Server. Now it's going to say what IP address. We're going to go ahead and run it on that one. That's the only one we have. This is the name of our domain, our fake domain that we created. It's saying, hey, what's the IP address you want to use for your internal DNS server? I'm going to go ahead and choose itself because it's also going to be a DNS server as well. Now it gives this alternate for 127.0.0.1. That's the loopback address. We'll just go ahead and delete that. We don't want the loopback added. All right, do we have WINS on this network? We do not. So we don't have any older computers, older than, say, Windows 2000, which still used WINS. We don't have anything like that. So we can also add in additional information such as the scope. We can do this now, or we can do it inside DHCP itself. We'll just go ahead and choose to do it inside DHCP. So just like we talked about, you've got stateless mode and you've got stateful mode. So we can enable the stateless mode if we want, and IP version 6 clients will automatically configured without using the DHCP server. So we'll go ahead and choose that. Okay, we've got our domain, we've got our stateless information. This is for version 6. And we're going to use our current credentials because we're logged in as administrator already. And we'll choose to install. This may take anywhere from a few seconds, as it will in this case, all the way up to several minutes, depending on how much resources you've given your virtual machine and how fast your host computer is and that kind of thing. So don't be discouraged if it takes a long time. Okay, so now we're going to go to Start, Administrative Tools, DHCP. And we're going to take our domain here, and we see an IP version 4, which is what we're going to set up. And we're going to add a scope. So, new scope. And we're just going to call it our test scope. So we're going to give a starting IP address of 192.168.0.100. And of course the lab will have you do this slightly differently. 150. And this is the subnet mask that we're using. It's a /24, and if you write out what a /24 is, it's 2553 times .0, because these are 8-bit octets. So 8 plus 8 plus 8 is 24. If we did a 32-bit, for instance, it would be 255 all the way across, and even at the end, which would mean one IP address, which it won't let you do. So it switches it to a 31, which gives you one IP address. We're going to go back to a 24 because we want to be able to do more than that. Okay, we'll go ahead and choose Next. Now it's going to say, hey, do you want to have any exclusions? So do we have any things that's a static IP address in that list that we want to exclude? Well, I know I have a printer at 192.168.0.110. So I'll just go ahead and put that in. And if you have multiple addresses, you can put in several of them here. All right, do we want to do a lease duration? Well, by default, it's going to be 8 days, and 8 days is just really too long. So I'll go ahead and change that to 1 day. And do I want to configure additional options? Well, yes, I do. So click Next. Let's put in a gateway. A gateway is our router. So 192.168.0.1. It could be router, firewall, whatever it is that you're using. Gives us the parent domain information, trying to put in the DNS information, we're going to take out that loopback address once again, and we're going to change this address to .2 because .2 is what this server is. And now it's just confirming. We're going to go ahead and say yes, add it anyway. Next, do we have any Win servers? The answer is no. Do we want to activate this scope now or later? We'll say now. All right, so now we have an active DHCP scope. We have server options that we set up. If you recall from that one slide, it said what the name of the options were and a number that goes next to it. So number 6, of course, is DNS servers, and then the domain name is also listed as well. So if we want to see if anyone is attached to our server, you'll see address leases, and right now it's blank. Now in the lab, you will be allowing your other computer, your other virtual machines, to be able to connect to this and get an automatic IP address. When that happens, you'll see the list of those servers or those computers in there. Reservations, this is what we talked about earlier, where I said that if you had something like a printer that you didn't want to statically set, but you wanted it to be the same IP address every single time, then you create a reservation. So you right-click and you choose to create a new reservation. So you can give it, we'll just say printer in copy room. Okay, so that's the one we want, and that's going to be .122. The MAC address is the IP address or the hardware address of that device. So if we know its current IP address, then we can ping it. So we would ping 192.168.0.122. We're not going to get a response because there is no printer there in reality. Then if we want to, what we want to do is we want to get the MAC address from that. So once we ping it, the MAC address actually shows up in the ARP cache, Address Resolution Protocol. So we do an ARP -A, and it shows us the IP address here and the physical address here. So this is the MAC address. So if we saw the 192.168.0.122 address, we would know this is the one we want. So let's go ahead and enable editing so we can copy that address. And then we just go and highlight it, and we'll choose to copy it. And then we'll paste that MAC address right here and choose add. So now whenever this particular device tries to connect to our network, it will automatically give it the 192.168.0.122 address. And from here we can add additional scope options if we want. Click on Configure Options. And again, here's the number and here's the name of all those options. And there are dozens of them. So you can sort of go through there and do a little reconnaissance on that. I'm going to go ahead and delete this reservation because we don't need it anymore. Now, you can also look at some of the interesting things in the DHCP servers. Right-click on it and go to Properties. You can see things like the location and the backup location of the files in case you need to find them. If you click on one level below it, you right-click on it and go to Properties. You see some other options. One of the options I like to set under Advanced is the conflict detection attempts. So I like to change that from 0 to 1. So what that'll do is it'll go out and make sure that there's nobody else out there with that same IP address as the one it's about to give it. And if there is, it won't do it. So if you leave it at 0, it won't check for that. If you leave it at 1, it will. So that'll keep that kind of stuff from happening. You can also set up network access protection. Again, you can disable or enable on all scopes to make sure the computers that are connecting are clean, such as have antivirus on them, up to date, etc., before you let them connect. DNS, you can also set some additional options here as well, and you can also make some changes here. You can also show the boot P table. Boot P are for Unix and Linux devices that use boot P instead of DHCP. So that gives you an idea on how to configure the DHCP server. All right, after installing the DHCP role, you need to configure for its initial use, which we just did. It requires at least one scope. We just created a scope. You saw how that was done. Exclusions, like I said, if you've got a static IP address on the network, then you want to exclude that from the scope. If you have a static IP address that's outside of the scope, like say our scope starts at 100, but the printer's at .99, you don't have to create the exclusion because it's not in the scope. Common practice, create exclusionary ranges at the beginning and end of a scope range. Options allows you to quickly and easily provide DHCP clients with updated configuration information. I showed you how to choose options and actually configure them. If you're using the default lease duration of 8 days, it could take up to 4 days before clients receive the new DHCP options. So if I went in and made a change, for instance, to the DNS server, and it's an 8-day lease, then it'll be a while before they actually get a chance to get updated. So that's why you don't want to have a long 8-day lease. Reservations, I just showed you how to create a reservation used in DHCP to give a client a static IP address without manually configuring a static IP on the client. You can leave them as DHCP, but it gives them the same IP every single time. Syntax for creating a reservation. Now this is using the NetSH. Remember in the last lab we talked about NetSH as being used for a lot of different things. One of those things is for configuring a DHCP server. So here's how you would create a reservation for a DHCP server. So here's the MAC address information and the name and the IP address. You can also create a DHCP exclusionary range as well if you wanted to exclude some static IP addresses. DHCP Client Service, responsible for the DHCP configuration process on a machine. So you'll see that DHCP Server service that's shown up after you install the DHCP Server role. Fault tolerance. This is a big one if you decide to take the Microsoft MCSE tests, or MCITP as they're called in 2008, that you use the 80-20 rule. So that means you want to have 2 DHCP servers on your network. They'll both contain scopes that do not overlap each other. For instance, I've got scope of 192.168.100 to 150. My second DHCP server may start from 151 and go to 170. So you want to have 80% of the IP addresses on one server, and in case that fails, you've got 20% of the IP addresses available on the other server. That's the 80-20 rule. DHCP Audit Log, it lists a lot of information when people get and release IP addresses, such as the ID, the date, the time, the IP, the MAC address, so you know who got what IP address and when. The DHCP server is automatically backed up every 60 minutes, but you could do a manual backup if you want, and here's the physical location. You can also restore a DHCP backup database from backup if you need to, using Windows Server Backup and other command line tools. You can reconcile the database, validates the DHCP database by comparing it with the registry values of the operating system. So there's an option there to verify or validate the DHCP database to make sure the database is working properly. So you can also start and stop a DHCP server service. You can do it through command line by typing net stop from a command prompt and then the name of the DHCP server or client. And same thing, you can stop it and start it. You can also do this from the services under Start Administrative Tools Services as well. If you wanted to troubleshoot DHCP, you can do an ipconfig/all, which I showed you a little while ago. You can also do an ipconfig release and renew. So if I do an ipconfig/release, it will release the IP address that I've received from the DHCP server in case I want to get an updated information, and then I would do renew after that. So the first one releases the IP address, and renew gets the new IP address from the DHCP server. So in summary, we talked about information provided by the DHCP server, DHCP to function properly in a routed network. There's also a relay agent if you have a DHCP server on another subnet and you want your computers in your subnet to receive the IP address from a different subnet, then you need to use a relay agent. The relay agent says, hey, don't get an IP address here locally, go through the router, go to the other network and grab it from there. DHCP uses a standard set of messages for communicating between the clients and the servers. Common communication processes we talked about. All data in DHCP is stored in a database, and we talked about the location. That might show up on a quiz. DHCP servers in an AD domain need to be authorized. So if you right-click on the DHCP server, you can unauthorize it, and you can authorize it once again if you need to. After it's installed, you must configure scopes for the clients to receive addresses. I showed you how to create the scope. And you can do all this by command line if you decide to not use the GUI, or if you wanted to do this from one server to another server, you can use command line. Uses exclusions, which I showed you how to do, and allows you to monitor DHCP using Performance Monitor, DHCP Statistics, and the Audit Log. So that is our Module 3 summary and lab, and we'll be looking forward for your work on that, and we'll be moving on to Module 4.